In this session, let's look at swaps, which is another important derivative which is heavily traded across the world. It is happening on large volume transactions, probably between institutional players. Large banks get involved into the transactions, large corporate get into the transaction. And as we have initially discussed, swap is nothing but exchange of cash flows. So one party may give in one form, take in some other form. So probably the most common form of that swaps is your interest rate swap, where probably one party is paying a fixed rate on some amount, and the other party is paying a floating rate on the same amount. So depending on whether the fixed rate is more than the floating rate, because if the floating rates are going down, if the interest rates in the market are going down, there is a chance that the fixed rate will be more than the floating rate. Similarly, if the interest rates in the market are going up, there is a chance that the floating rate is greater than the fixed rate. Depending on whichever the rate is greater, one party passes the benefits to the other party. That's a typical way any swap transaction goes up. And the prime motive behind the execution of this swap is there is a a speculation angle, as well as there is a hedging kind of an angle also. Because someone, let's say I have a big floating rate loan, right? I have taken a loan heavily on a floating rate. So I have to pay to my bank the floating rate, right? And let's say you are having a big fixed rate loan. Now, somehow I am of the feeling, right? Somehow I am of the feeling that in future the interest rates are going to go up. You are of the feeling that the interest rates are going to go down. And if the interest rates are going to go up, I am at a big loss, right? Because I have to pay a huge loan to my bank. So what I will do, I will try to identify you who is thinking opposite to me. If not I directly identifying, there is an intermediary like an investment bank who will play the role of identifying you who is exactly thinking in opposite direction to me. He'll try to patch up both of us. Now in this patch up, what is happening, we both will get into an agreement saying whatever is the amount which would be the worth of our loan, let's assume whatever be the amount, I will pay you a fixed rate, you will pay me a floating rate. I'll pay you a fixed rate, you will pay me a floating rate. Now what is happening, my liability, even if the interest rate in the market goes up, I am receiving a higher money from you or for that same notional amount, right? We both are getting into a swap saying virtually, this is a virtual scenario, for the same amount, let's say 1 million, right? Let's say I had a loan of 1 million on a fixed rate, on a floating rate. You had a loan of 1 million on a fixed rate. Worry for us is, if for me is interest rates are going up, then in floating I have to pay a huge amount. Worry for you is, if the floating rates are going down, you have to pay a huge amount on the fixed rate. So because of this worry, we both came together for a swap. So in that swap, what we are saying is, we will fix a notional amount of 1 million. On that 1 million, whatever is the fixed rate, I'll pay you that fixed rate amount. Whatever is the floating rate, you pay me the floating rate amount. So now at any point in time, I'm getting the floating rate from you, which I can pay directly to my bank. You are getting a fixed rate from me, which is what is the agreement you had with your bank. So overall, it's a risk mitigation situation. So the hedging can very well be used with respect to swaps. And if at all I have an underlying and I want to protect that underlying, whether it is in the form of assets or in the form of liabilities, I have to receive a loan or I have to pay a loan. whatever it is, I can protect myself by getting into this swap kind of an agreement. So in this, it's purely an OTC transaction. Yeah, it's purely an OTC transaction where only cash flows are exchanged, right? Commodities and all don't come into picture in case of swap, only the real money from both the parties, right? So probably it could be in currencies, it could be the interest rates. We can talk about so many others, but the most common one is the interest rates and currency swaps. These two are the most popular forms of swap. So here, some notional principal amount is fixed because no one will exchange the principal at all. It's only notional in nature. And so there could be a decision saying one party will pay a fixed rate, some interest rate. We'll see how they will decide that. And the other party will pay a floating interest rate, which means this party will receive a floating interest rate based on some reference rate. And as we have initially discussed, the most common reference rate that is being used for derivative transactions is your interbank LIBOR rate itself, right? So LIBOR plus 2%, LIBOR plus 1%, something could be set depending on the credit worthiness of the other party. We can very well set LIBOR plus some percentage as a part of the floating rate of interest. And some of the most common features with interest rate swaps are they happen in the same currency. Both the parties will pay in the same currency, and that's the reason principal exchange is not required. In currency swap, we will see because the currencies are different, principal exchange happens there. Whereas in interest rate swap, principal exchange does not happen. Only the interest rates get exchanged between the both the parties. And one more thing is, you should look at swap as a series of forward contracts. Means the swap agreement is generally done once for a longer period. Probably we may say I'm getting into a 2-year swap, right? Which means the agreement is between two of us is for 2 years, but the payments will be not once, but it will be more times. Every quarter we will make the payment. So there are 8 payments that happen between both of us every quarter for a 2 years. So this is how any swap contract will be defined. So the fixed rate is decided for 2-year period. The fixed rate is decided for a 2-year period, whatever is the period of swap, and we are saying quarterly payments. So in some periods, probably floating rate could be more than the fixed rate. In some periods, the fixed rate can be more than the floating rate, whatever is the possibility. That fixed rate again is determined based on the how the forward LIBOR rates are being appearing to us. So if the LIBOR is going to go up in future, probably your fixed rate will be higher. Otherwise, the fixed rates will be lower. Now, so one more thing in all the interest rate transactions which you have to remember is whenever the interest rate, let's say today's interest rate is 5%, right? The interest rate, whatever is known at the beginning of the period, the payment of it actually happens at the end of the period. Even in the banks, if we see today I take the loan, they tell me today itself what is the interest rate. But the real payment of that interest happens at the end of the period. Even in case of EMIs or whatever it is, the rate is known at the beginning of the period, but it is paid at the end of the period. Even in case of floating rate loan, that's the same concept. Floating rate loan, there is a misconception which says probably if I am paying the loan on 31st March, the interest rate on 31st March, whatever is it, that is the interest that I have to pay. No, if I am paying on 31st March, and probably it's a quarterly payment, whatever the interest rate on 1st Jan, which is the beginning of the quarter, whatever is the floating interest rate on 1st of Jan, that would be paid on 31st of March. Same thing, whatever is decided on 1st of April, it would be paid on 30th of June. That's a typical scenario with any interest rate payment, which means whether it is a floating or fixed, at the beginning of the period, whatever is the interest rate, at least I know how much amount I have to pay at the end of the next period, at the end of the current period. The next periods I may not know, but at least what I have to pay at the end of the current period, I am very much clear on it. Right? That's one aspect we need to be comfortable with in doing all these kind of calculations. And as a hedging purpose, as we have said, I can very well transform my fixed or floating rate assets or liabilities to the other, because when I have a big floating rate liability, I can very well get into a swap transaction and eliminate that liability altogether. Where when I have a floating rate asset, getting into a swap transaction, I can make it, I can offset it into a fixed rate asset, because I am assured of how much I will be getting. So these kind of transactions from a hedging standpoint can really help me to manage, depending on whether my liabilities are weaker, or liabilities are risky, or assets are risky. I can try to transform one to the other and reduce my risk in the overall process. Now, from a computation standpoint, let's look at this small example. So this is how the contract will be designed. A and B, a 2-year interest rate swap agreement. Cash flows are exchanged semi-annually. Right? The fixed rate is 4.28% for the entire period. For the entire 2 years, we are deciding today itself. Then, floating rates are based on 6-month LIBOR, whose values are like this. The 6-month interest rate today is 3.5%. After 6 months, we are assuming it to be 4, then 4.5, then 5, then 5.5%. And we are saying notional principal is 50 million, on which this interest rates will be applied. Now I want to find out the cash flows of each of the semi-annual period. What are the cash flows in each of the semi-annual period? So we'll look at let's say right now the interest rate is 3.5%, then it is 4, then it is 4.5, then 5, then 5.5. Whereas when I am talking about a fixed rate across the period, it is 4.28% itself.